Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. We discussed the subject of epistemology, Buddhist epistemology, and in our last talk we discussed mainly the history of Western philosophy, and we entered the subject of Buddhism very lightly and towards the end. So I would like to say something more about the teachings of the Buddha by showing that this history of Western philosophy has been traced by the Buddha in the Kalama Sutra. Many people who have translated the Kalama Sutra and very often quoted, they never saw this properly. They always thought that the Buddha was a rationalist, which is incorrect. The story in this sutra is that the Buddha went to a part of India called the Kalaman. The people in that area they were fairly intelligent people, and they were interested in asking a very important question. They asked the Buddha about truth. They said, there are so many people who come to our city and they keep on making speeches and saying that what they say is the truth, and all other views are false. So they begin to praise their own views and condemn other people's views. So we have a problem. Whom should we believe? And who can we trust? So whom can we trust or accept as correct? So the Buddha said, well, when doubtful matters arise, it is quite okay to doubt. When a doubtful matter arises, it is quite proper to doubt. And then he says, do not go by what you have heard or what you have read in books, or just it is in your tradition. Do not accept something as true because it is coming in that way. Now, when the Buddha said this, he was really giving up that first level of thinking, which is called traditionalism. So he gave up the traditional belief in traditions. that I spoke of earlier. And then he says, do not accept something even because it is rational or because it is based on good logic. So when he says this, he has rejected the rationalist way of thinking. And then he says, do not accept something even because it is based on your experience. Now, I translate it like that. The Pali words are akara parivitakka. Akara parivitakka. Akara means what you observe. Parivitakka means inference from what you observe. Akara is what it appears to you, whatever appears to you through your observation. You draw an inference based on that. You draw a conclusion or formulate a theory to explain what you have observed. Now that is the akara parivitakka. Vitakka means takka. Vitakka, takka means logic, and vitakka means an inference, logical, rational inference through observation of what is perceived through the senses. So that is empirical thinking. So that he rejects the empirical form of looking for truth. And then he says, don't accept even what is perceived through a mystical experience. And that the Pali words are ditti nijjana kanti. Ditti nijjana kanti. The nijjana refers to the jhanas. Ditti is a view. Nijjana kanti means acceptance of a view seen through jhanas, which are an empirical experience. I'm sorry, not an empirical experience, a mystic experience, mystical experience. So jhana is when you meditate, you enter a certain state of calmness or tranquility of mind, and that becomes a mystical experience. And in that mystical experience, you might see certain things. And mystical experiences are not always the jhanas. They can also become something like a hypnotic state. And so the Buddha speaks of samadhi as samma samadhi and miccha samadhi. But both miccha samadhi refers to the wrong kind of samadhi. Samma samadhi is the right kind of samadhi. And but both are samadhi. So that the jhana, the word jhana there, refers to samadhi. And whatever is seen when you are in a mystical state, people can accept as true. And that is also rejected here. This is what he did. And this we can compare to what is called the transcendentalist thinking. The transcendentalists were the people in Western philosophy who spoke about how the mystics can experience this truth that is transcendental and the truth that cannot be observed by normal people. So he has rejected that. And then he also speaks about acceptance of what a teacher says through faith in the teacher. Now that we can equate to the existential philosophers like Kierkegaard, who spoke about the leap of faith. And so, having rejected all that, now the Buddha says, when you know for yourself that a certain action is good and a certain action is bad, then you give up that bad action and you perform the good action. So you are thinking in terms of good and bad. Now what does that mean? There is something very important here. Now he is not talking about truth. What is he talking about? He is now talking about good and bad, instead of talking about truth and falsehood. Why is he talking about good and bad instead of truth and falsehood? You see, the important point is that he has now given up going after truth. He is only concerned with what is good and what is bad. He has brought a question in the field of epistemology into the field of ethics. He has got into ethics, not epistemology, which is looking for truth. But in doing this, he is also entering the pragmatic way of thinking. You are thinking in terms of solving a problem rather than looking for truth. The solution to a problem is what is good. Now the existential philosophers said truth and goodness is equal, is the same. And this is what the Buddha is trying to arrive at. So when you know certain things are good, then do it. When you know certain things are bad, avoid it. And then he further says, when you know that wise people approve of a certain deed, then do it. That means, in other words, it is a wise thing to do a certain thing. It is unwise to do the bad things. That's another part to it. And then the third part is, when you know the consequences of that act, whether the act will ultimately lead to the happiness of oneself and others, then do it. When you know that a certain action leads to the unhappiness of oneself and others, then don't do it. So there are three ways he is judging the action. One is simply to say whether it is good or bad. The other is whether it is wise or unwise. And the other one is whether it leads to happiness or whether it leads to unhappiness. I have been thinking about this, and I came out with another important problem, important idea that the Buddha saw here. And that is something that a psychologist, Sigmund Freud, brought out. And that was, Freud said, there are two parts of the personality of any person. There are three parts really, three parts. One he called the id, the other he called the ego, and the third one he called the superego. The id was simply our emotions, and our emotions are really reactions to the pleasure and pain. We desire pleasure and we hate pain. And this desire for pleasure and hatred of pain is the id. And Freud also said the id is dominated by the pleasure principle. So the id is concerned with pleasure. Then he also spoke about the second part, which he called the ego. The ego is really the rational faculty, the ability to think and reason out. That is the ego. And the third one is the superego, which is concerned not with pleasure or with truth and reality, but with being good. It's moral part of the self. The superego wants to be moral, to do the right thing. This idea brought out by Freud, which was supposed to be a discovery of his, but at the same time, the Buddha has been using this concept. Now, I don't have the time to discuss the Buddha's views about this whole thing. We can discuss it at a later stage. But the important thing here is that when he spoke about these three ways of judging an action, those three ways are related to this. First, he said, see whether this action is good or bad. That is the concern of the superego. Then he said, see whether this action is wise or unwise. That is the aim of the ego part. And we see whether this action leads to happiness or whether it leads to unhappiness. And that is the aim of the id. You see? So these three parts of the personality are paid attention to here. So the important thing about the Buddha here is that he has rejected the pursuit of truth, but at the same time he speaks about the Four Noble Truths. What are these Four Noble Truths if the truth has been rejected? There again he has taken the pragmatic view, which says there is no truth to be discovered, but there are only problems to be solved. And the most important basic problem is the problem of existence, where we become aware of death, and the anxiety connected with death becomes the problem. And it is that problem that the Buddha calls dukkha. And he speaks about the cause of dukkha and the cessation of dukkha and the way leading to the cessation of dukkha, which is the solution to that problem. And so, because a solution that really solves the problem can be called the truth. This is why the Buddha calls the Four Noble Truths. So it is the truth in that sense. Now, there is another sutra called the Chanki Sutra, where the Buddha comes up with another way of discussing truth. He says, he uses three words. One is Satchanurakhi, Satchanubodho, and Satchanupatti. Satchanurakhi is something we can translate as the preservation of truth, to preserve the truth. Satchanurakhi. Satchanubodho is to understand the truth. Satchanubodho. And Satchanupatti is to enter the truth. Satchanupatti. You enter the truth. Now, when he speaks about Satchanurakhi, or preserving the truth, he says, if a person says, and therefore it is the truth, he is not preserving the truth. So instead of saying that it is the truth, if he can say, this is what I have read, then he is preserving the truth. If he heard it from some person, and if he can say, this is what I heard, then he is preserving the truth, because he is telling the truth. In other words, the important thing here is not to speak of a truth, but to be truthful. So when you speak of what you have heard, this is what I heard, you are speaking the truth. If you say this is the truth, then you are not speaking the truth. So that way, that is the preservation of truth. So the next one is to understand or realize the truth. That understanding or realizing the truth is to solve a problem. It is to solve the problem. That solution of the problem is the realization of the truth. Because what we call truth is simply the solution to the problem. And solving the problem itself is the truth, realizing the truth. Then he speaks about entering the truth. Now, entering the truth is really, the way he explains it, it is the way, following the way to the realization of the truth. Following the way, there is a method of realizing the truth. It is the gradual evolution of the consciousness, as I spoke some time earlier. The method of realizing the truth, that is the important way to enter the truth. So the Buddha speaks of these three things. One is the preserving the truth, the realizing the truth, and entering the truth. So this is very important here. And so this way of thinking is also very important. And when we say the Buddha has not been speaking about truth as an absolute truth, because he says, Naheva saccani bahuni nana anyatra sanyaya niccani loke. There are no many truths in the world other than sanya, perception. There are no many truths in the world other than perception. Then he says, Takkancha dittisu pakappayitva saccang musati dvedamma mahu. Using logic on views, people begin to speak about two things called truth and falsehood. So what that means is that there is really no such thing as a truth or a falsehood. It is only when people begin to use logic that they begin to talk about truth and falsehood. We can only talk about perceptions, and there is no truth other than perceptions. So he accepts that empirical point of view also in saying that. And then of course he points out that by becoming attached to the perceptions, one is not free from dukkha, even the process of birth, old age and death. And it is only by complete detachment from all that that the problem is finally solved. So in other words, that final solution becomes the understanding of the truth. So I hope you understood the Buddhist epistemology, and I hope you'll benefit. May you all be well, comfortable, peaceful and happy.